After my marriage, my evil and manipulative mother-in-law wanted to move into my house to meddle in my life, but I firmly refused. Then, my husband started threatening me and making my life impossible. 5 months later, I discovered that this woman was really his. Gabriella stood in the kitchen, drying her hands after washing the dishes. She watched the steam rising from the sink, her mind wandering over the little things that had been bothering her lately. The wall clock showed 9 in the evening, and the house was eerily silent, something unusual since Bullen had started spending so much time there. Gabriella sighed. That night, Yusep wasn't home, and the weight of loneliness crushed her like never before. It was a different silence, filled with unanswered questions. She turned toward the living room, where the echo of her husband's words that morning still resonated in her mind. "My mother wants to move in with us," he had said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Gabriella had felt a cold chill run down her spine when she heard it. That "my mother" wasn't just an innocent phrase, it represented an invasion she deeply feared. "Move in here?" Gabriella asked, trying to stay calm as she sipped her coffee, though the very thought made her stomach churn. "Yes, just until she gets settled," Yusep responded with that carefree smile that sometimes seemed like an impenetrable mask. "You know things have been tough for her." Gabriella watched him in silence. For a moment, she felt like she didn't recognize the man standing in front of her. Since when had Yusep been so concerned about his mother? Something in her gut told her there was more to this than he was willing to admit. "But, Yusep, it's not the best time. We're just starting to adjust to our married life." Gabriella tried to choose her words carefully, but the truth was that the very idea of sharing her home with Bullen filled her with anxiety. He looked at her, his eyes hardening just a little, but enough for Gabriella to notice. "My mother has no one else, Gabriella. I'm not going to leave her alone." There was something in that tone she hadn't heard before, something final and cold that made her take a step back. Now, standing in the kitchen, Gabriella felt tears welling behind her eyelids, but she held them back. This wasn't the moment to break down. Not yet. She had to think. She had to understand what was really going on. Since the wedding, everything had been a whirlwind. Yusep, who once seemed so in love and attentive, had started to change shortly after Bullen entered their lives. Little things at first. One more call to his mother, an unannounced visit from her. But now, this proposal, no, this ultimatum, changed everything. Determined not to get trapped in her own fear, Gabriella grabbed her phone and called her friend Laura. She needed to vent, but she also wanted advice. Laura had always been direct and honest with her, no sugarcoating. "Laura," Gabriella said when she heard the familiar voice on the other end of the line. "Gabby, what's wrong?" Laura asked, immediately sensing the worry in her voice. "Yusep wants his mother to move in with us." Gabriella let the words out quickly, as if saying them faster would lessen the weight of the reality. There was a brief silence before Laura spoke. "Bullen? The same woman who criticized your home's decor the first day she met you? The one who implied you didn't know how to cook in front of her entire family?" Gabriella smiled bitterly. "Yes, that one. And he seems determined. I don't know what to do, Laura. This doesn't feel right. Something's up about all this." "I know," Laura replied, her tone concerned. "Gabby, you need to talk to him again, but firmly. If you give in now, she'll settle into your life for good, and it won't be easy to get her out later." "I know, but every time I try to reason with him about it, he gets defensive. It's like his mother is untouchable. He's never been like this before." Laura sighed on the other end of the phone. "Look, I don't want to plant doubts in your mind, but something about this isn't right. Yusep has changed and Bullen isn't exactly a saint. Have you considered that maybe there's more to this than meets the eye?" Gabriella's heart raced at that question. It wasn't the first time she had thought about it, but until now, she had dismissed it as paranoia. "What are you suggesting?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm not sure. Just be careful, okay? Watch. Listen. Don't make any hasty decisions, but don't let yourself get dragged into something you don't want either." Gabriella thanked Laura and hung up, but her mind kept racing. There was something about the way Yusep had been acting that made her doubt. Why was he suddenly more concerned about his mother than his wife? And the most unsettling question, why did Bullen always find an excuse to stay longer than she should? That night, when Yusep returned home, Gabriella watched him closely as he took off his jacket and tossed it onto the couch. "Did you talk to your mother?" she asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Yusep nodded, avoiding her gaze as he poured himself a glass of water. "Yes, I told her she could move in soon. She just needs to get a few things in order first." Gabriella's heart sank. The decision had already been made. She hadn't had any say in that conversation. Everything had been done behind her back. "Yusep, I think we need to talk about this." Gabriella approached him, trying not to sound confrontational, but her hands trembled slightly. "Talk about what?" he replied without lifting his eyes from the glass he was holding. "I don't think it's a good idea for your mother to move in with us." The words finally came out, filled with the anxiety she had felt all day. Yusep looked at her then, but his eyes were different, harder, almost as if he were someone else. "My mother is moving in, Gabriella, whether you like it or not." The firmness in his voice left Gabriella breathless. There was no room for discussion. This wasn't a decision they were going to make together. It was a command. Gabriella felt the cold sting of betrayal run through her. What was once a marriage built on love and mutual respect now felt like an emotional prison. That night, when she went to bed, Gabriella couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, feeling everything around her slowly crumble. She knew something was terribly wrong, but she still couldn't understand what it was. But one thing was certain: if she didn't do something soon, her life, her home, and her marriage would be in danger. Gabriella got up early the next morning, after having slept just a few hours. The dawn barely illuminated the gray sky, but the exhaustion couldn't stop the restlessness she felt in her chest. Since the conversation with Yusep the night before, her mind hadn't stopped spinning about everything. The certainty that something dark was hiding behind Yusep's sudden insistence that his mother move in consumed her. The man who used to be her refuge was now a constant source of worry. She made coffee with trembling hands, trying to focus on the simplest tasks to avoid overthinking. But nothing could chase away the growing discomfort settling in her stomach. As the coffee machine bubbled, she remembered Laura's words, "Be careful, watch and listen." Gabriella knew she had to do that, but where to start? The aroma of coffee filled the kitchen, and Gabriella poured herself a cup while contemplating the emptiness of the house. In that silence, a decision began to take shape in her mind. She couldn't keep ignoring her instincts. She couldn't keep passively waiting for something to blow up. She needed answers. And the only way to get them was by investigating on her own. She knew she couldn't confront Yusep directly, not without proof or certainty, but maybe there was a way to unravel what was happening without alerting him. Hours later, when Yusep left for work, Gabriella made sure the house was completely empty. She knew she was acting in a way she never would have imagined in her previous life. Rummaging through her husband's belongings made her feel dirty, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that she was being manipulated. She started in Yusep's office, a small room at the end of the hallway that he used to work from home when he wasn't at the office. In that space, Gabriella had felt an invisible barrier between them over the past few months. Yusep spent hours there, often with the door closed, and every time she approached to enter, he found an excuse to avoid it. Now, that office had become the epicenter of her suspicions. Upon entering, Gabriella felt the air grow heavy, as if every object in the room held secrets. Her gaze quickly scanned the organized desk, the meticulously stacked papers, and a closed laptop on the surface. She approached cautiously, and her heart started racing as she took the computer in her hands. She sat down in Yusep's chair, feeling the cold leather beneath her skin, and opened the laptop. "God, please let it be unlocked," she murmured to herself. The screen came to life, asking for a password. Gabriella sighed, frustrated. Of course, it wasn't going to be that easy. After trying several obvious combinations that didn't work, Gabriella set the computer aside, her mind racing for another way to get information. That's when she noticed a folder of papers half hidden under some books on the shelf. She got up immediately and pulled it out with quick but careful hands. The first documents appeared to be normal contracts, Yusep's work. But as she went further, she found something that made her stop dead in her tracks. There were bank receipts and statements showing transfers of large sums of money. Gabriella frowned, unable to understand what those transactions were for. "What the hell is this?" she muttered as she examined the documents more closely. The account names weren't familiar, and the most puzzling thing was that there were no records of those transactions in the joint accounts they shared. Among the papers, there was a letter. As she read it, Gabriella felt the ground crumble beneath her feet. It was a foreclosure notice addressed to Bullen. The letter detailed exorbitant debts, sums of money that Bullen owed to several lenders. The letter was dated several months ago, even before Yusep had first mentioned that his mother was having difficulties. Gabriella felt her breathing quicken. Why had Yusep hidden something so important from her? Worse, why was he so desperate to bring Bullen into their home? The puzzle pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture forming was much darker than she had imagined. Her head was spinning. She needed to talk to someone, to share this before reality crushed her. She grabbed her phone and, without thinking twice, called Laura again. "Laura, you're not going to believe what I just found," Gabriella said, her voice trembling as she paced around the living room, staring at the letter in her hand as if it were a bomb about to explode. "What happened?" Laura asked, immediately alarmed by Gabriella's tone. "I found debt documents from Bullen. She owes a lot of money, and she hasn't told anyone. Yusep knows, but he hasn't said anything to me. It's clear he wants to bring her to our house because of it, to protect or cover for her in some way. This is way beyond what we thought." Gabriella paused, trying to calm herself. "I don't know what to do." There was a long silence before Laura spoke. "Gabby, this is much more serious than it seems. If Yusep has been hiding something this big from you, you have to be very careful with what you do from now on. Maybe this explains why he's so desperate to help her, but it still doesn't justify him keeping it from you. You can't trust him fully right now, not until you have all the answers." Gabriella nodded, even though she knew Laura couldn't see her. The pain in her chest was unbearable. She felt like her marriage was crumbling before her eyes, and each day seemed to bring a new betrayal. "You're right," she said finally. "I can't confront him yet. I need more proof, more answers. I don't want to act impulsively and make things worse." "Do what you have to do, but don't do it alone," Laura insisted. "I'm here for you." They hung up and Gabriella stayed in the living room, feeling trapped between the need to act and the fear of what she might uncover if she kept digging deeper. That night, when Yusep returned home, Gabriella tried to act as if everything was normal. But every word he said, every gesture he made her doubt even more. How much of what she knew about her husband was really true? And, worse yet, how much longer could she keep pretending everything was okay? As they ate dinner, Yusep glanced at her sideways, noticing her silence. "Everything okay?" he asked, seemingly unconcerned, as he cut a piece of meat on his plate. Gabriella looked up and forced a smile. "Yes, I'm just tired," she lied. "We've been stressed lately. My mom's going to need our help, but we'll get through this," Yusep added in a voice that tried to be reassuring but sounded oddly mechanical. Gabriella nodded, not daring to say anything more. She knew she was now in the middle of something much bigger than she had imagined. But what she didn't know was how it would all end. As she lay down that night, Gabriella decided she wouldn't just stand by waiting for the outcome. She needed to prepare for what was coming, and if that meant discovering more painful truths, she would do it. Gabby woke up the next day with a sense of emptiness she couldn't shake. The previous night had been one of the longest of her life. She had barely slept, trapped in a web of thoughts and emotions that kept her on the edge of despair. She knew time was working against her, that every day she didn't confront the situation was a day Yusep and Bullen got closer to executing whatever they were planning. She still couldn't see the full picture, but the pieces were there, waiting to be connected. Sitting in the kitchen, with the sun barely peeking through the window, Gabriella went over the documents she had found the day before. No matter how many times she read them, the feeling of betrayal was the same. Yusep had hidden too much from her. What hurt the most wasn't just that Bulin was in serious financial trouble, but that Yusep was willing to drag her, his own wife, into that chaos without giving her a chance to understand what was happening. As she slowly stirred the coffee in her cup, the kitchen door opened. Yusep appeared, his demeanor calm, as if everything was normal. Gabriella felt a mixture of anger and sadness. How could he act like nothing had changed? "Good morning," Yusep said, smiling at her, as if the arguments from the past few days hadn't happened. Gabriella looked at him for a second before responding. "Good morning," she murmured, trying to keep her tone neutral. Yusep poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from her, the sound of the chair scraping against the floor breaking the tense silence between them. "I've been thinking," Yusep began, with a tone that tried to sound conciliatory. "I know the thing with my mother took you by surprise, and I understand it's not easy, but she really needs our help." Gabriella placed her cup on the table, looking directly into Yusep's eyes. "It's not just the surprise, Yusep," she responded carefully. "It's the lack of transparency. Your mother has serious problems, and you've been hiding that from me. This isn't something we can ignore." Yusep looked at her, blinking slowly, as if processing her words more carefully than usual. "Gabriella, I didn't want to worry you. Things aren't that simple. My mother has always been very private about her matters, and I was just trying to protect you from all that stress. I thought I could handle it." Gabriella felt a lump in her throat. She knew that wasn't the whole truth. There was more, something Yusep still wasn't willing to admit. "Protecting me doesn't mean lying to me," she said, unable to keep her voice from trembling slightly. "And it doesn't mean you make all the decisions for both of us." Yusep sighed, rubbing his temples as if his head suddenly ached. "I don't want to fight, Gabriella. We already have enough to deal with my mother. This will be resolved soon. I just need you to trust me a little longer." Gabriella looked at him, searching his face for some sign of sincerity, something that would make her believe that, somehow, she could come out of this intact. But she found nothing. Just evasion and an unease she hadn't felt before. "It's not just about your mother, Yusep," she added, her heart racing. "There's something else going on, something you're not telling me. If you really expect me to trust you, then I need to know the whole truth." Yusep's face hardened for a moment. It was such a quick gesture that Gabriella barely had time to process it, but it was enough to confirm her suspicions. He was hiding something more. "There's nothing else," Yusep replied, but the tone of his voice betrayed the lie. Gabriella nodded slowly, knowing the conversation wasn't going anywhere that morning. But she couldn't stop now. There was a dark truth lurking in the shadows of her life, and she was determined to bring it to light. Later, after Yusep left for work, Gabriella sat on the living room couch, her mind racing, searching for answers. She knew she had to be careful with every step she took. She needed more information, more proof before making any drastic decisions. It was then that she decided to do something she had never done before: check their bank records. She opened her laptop, logged into their joint account, and began reviewing the transactions from the past few months. Her stomach churned as she saw several transfers she didn't recognize, large sums of money that weren't related to anything she knew about. What disturbed her the most, however, wasn't the transfers themselves, but the fact that they were all made to an account under a name unfamiliar to her: Mariana Aguilar. Gabriella frowned. Who was Mariana Aguilar? Why had Yusep been transferring money to someone else? Her mind immediately jumped to the worst conclusions, but she knew she had to be cautious before confronting Yusep again. That afternoon, when Laura came to visit, Gabriella couldn't hold back and told her everything. "I found strange transactions in our account," Gabriella said, her eyes fixed on the table as Laura watched her closely. "Large sums of money, all under the name of someone I don't know." Laura, always pragmatic, took a sip of her tea before responding. "Are you sure it's not just a work account or something like that?" Laura asked, trying to maintain the calm that Gabriella couldn't. "I don't know," Gabriella admitted, frustrated. "I have no idea who Mariana Aguilar is, but something inside me tells me this isn't right. It's like every day I discover something new, something darker." Laura looked at her with a mixture of compassion and concern. Gabby, I know you don't want to think the worst, but if Yusep has been hiding things from you, and now you find this, you need to protect yourself. You can't keep trusting that he's going to tell you the truth. Gabriella nodded. She knew Laura was right. It felt like she was walking on thin ice, and each step brought her closer to the collapse of everything she thought she knew. That night, before Yusep came home, Gabriella made a decision. If he wasn't going to be honest with her, then she would have to seek the truth by other means. She picked up her phone and began searching online for the name Mariana Aguilar. She knew it was a long shot, but if this person had something to do with Yusep, maybe she could find a clue. After several failed attempts, she found something that left her paralyzed. Mariana Aguilar was linked to a series of fraud accusations in another city, accusations that had never gone far, but whose pattern was eerily similar to what Gabriella was experiencing. Mariana had worked alongside someone who had never been named in the investigations. A woman. Gabriella set the phone down on the table, her heart racing. What if Bullen was behind all this, not just as a victim of debts, but as part of a larger network of deception? She didn't know how she would face what she had just discovered, but one thing was certain: the situation was about to explode. And this time, Gabriella wasn't going to stay silent. Gabriella paced back and forth in the living room, her hands trembling as she tried to process what she had just discovered. The name Mariana Aguilar wasn't just a potential threat to her marriage, but a much more sinister truth than she could have ever imagined. The pieces were finally falling into place. Bullen, Yusep, Mariana. Everything was part of a web of deception and lies much larger than she had foreseen. Gabriella felt trapped in a web that had been carefully woven around her. That night, Yusep returned later than usual, which only heightened Gabriella's suspicions. As he walked in with an apparently carefree smile, she felt a knot in her stomach. How could he act so normal, knowing everything he'd been hiding? Gabriella had spent the day gathering more information about Bullen and Mariana, discovering that both were linked to multiple fraud cases in different cities. Mariana wasn't just another person, she was an accomplice of Bullen. Yusep placed his briefcase on the table and approached Gabriella to kiss her, but she subtly pulled away, feeling a chill run through her skin. He looked at her, frowning. "Are you okay?" he asked, with a slight note of suspicion in his voice. Gabriella nodded, but couldn't help her body from tensing up. Every fiber of her being wanted to scream, confront him right away, but she knew she couldn't do that yet. She needed to stay calm. She needed a plan. "Yeah, I'm just tired," she muttered, trying not to show the internal chaos she felt. Yusep watched her for a moment longer before nodding and heading to the kitchen to pour himself a glass of water. Gabriella stood there, her mind racing. She needed time to think, to decide her next move. She knew that what was at stake wasn't just her marriage, but also her safety. If Bullen and Mariana were capable of deceiving and manipulating so many people, they wouldn't hesitate to do whatever was necessary to protect their plan. The next morning, Gabriella woke up with a new sense of determination. She could no longer be a victim of circumstance. She dressed quickly and, without saying anything to Yusep, left the house. She needed space to breathe and think clearly. Her destination, her lawyer's office. Sitting in front of him, Gabriella told him everything she had discovered, from the bank transactions to the connection between Bullen and Mariana. The lawyer listened attentively, his eyes narrowing with each new revelation. "Gabriella, this is very serious," he said finally. "If what you're saying is true, you're not just in a complicated situation with Yusep, but you might also be in danger. We need to proceed cautiously. What can I do?" Gabriella asked, feeling vulnerable but determined to fight. "The first thing is to ensure you have control over your finances," the lawyer replied. "You need to protect your assets before anything more serious happens. We can take steps to freeze joint accounts and prevent him or his mother from accessing your property." Gabriella nodded. The mere act of taking action gave her a sense of control she had lost months ago. However, there was still a part of her that couldn't help but cling to a small hope that Yusep wasn't fully involved. She wanted to believe that somehow he had been dragged into this by his mother, that maybe he wasn't aware of the whole truth. That night, after taking the first legal steps to protect herself, Gabriella returned home with a sense of clarity, but also with a heavy heart. Yusep was waiting for her in the living room with a serious expression. He seemed to know that something had changed in her. "We need to talk," he said, his voice tense. Gabriella sat across from him, preparing for what was coming. It was time to face the truth. "You're right," she replied, looking him directly in the eyes. "We need to talk, but it's not going to be an easy conversation." Yusep leaned forward, frowning. "What's going on, Gabriella? You've been acting strange. Is this about my mother?" he asked, as if trying to find a simple explanation for everything that was happening. Gabriella took a deep breath before speaking, feeling her heart pounding. "I've discovered a lot of things, Yusep. Things you've been hiding." Her voice was firm, though inside she felt the weight of the confrontation. "I know about your mother's debts. I know about Mariana Aguilar, and I know you've been lying to me." Yusep froze, his eyes widening in surprise. The mention of Mariana threw him completely off balance. The silence between them was heavy, as if the air itself had become unbearably dense. "I don't know what you're talking about," he tried to say, but his voice wavered slightly. Gabriella looked at him in disbelief. She no longer had the patience for lies. "Don't lie, Yusep. I know everything. I know your mother and Mariana have been involved in scams. I know they've been using me to get out of their problems." Gabriella felt a lump in her throat, but she continued. "How could you let this go so far? How could you put me in the middle of all this?" Yusep let out a heavy sigh, and for a moment, it seemed like he was about to confess everything. His shoulders slumped, and guilt began to show on his face. "Gabriella, I didn't know things would get to this point," he finally said, his voice broken. "At first, I just wanted to help my mother. I knew she had problems, but I didn't think it was this serious. And when Mariana showed up, everything got more complicated. I don't know how to stop it." Gabriella felt a pang of sadness in her chest. At that moment, she didn't know whether to pity him or feel angrier. There was sincerity in his confession, but also a weakness that made her doubt. "You put me in danger, Yusep," she said, holding back tears. "If you really loved me, how could you let this happen? How could you let your mother drag me into all of this?" Yusep ran his hands through his hair, frustrated and defeated. "I don't know, Gabriella. I don't know. I feel trapped. She, Bullen, has always had that power over me. Ever since I was a kid, she's manipulated me, made me feel like I can't say no to her. But I didn't know Mariana was involved in all of this until it was too late." Gabriella stood up, unable to bear listening anymore. Yusep's words were a mix of truth and evasion, and she couldn't keep waiting for him to decide to act. "It doesn't matter anymore, Yusep," she said, her voice firm. "I've taken steps to protect myself. And if you keep letting your mother control your life, then we can't be together anymore. You need to choose." Yusep looked at her, his eyes filled with confusion and fear. He knew he had reached his limit. But Gabriella no longer had the strength to save him. She knew that for her own sake, and for his, she had to put an end to this cycle of manipulation. The truth had finally come to light, and though it hurt, Gabriella felt liberated. Gabriella woke up the next morning with a mix of calm and anxiety. The conversation with Yusep the night before had been more revealing than she expected, but it had also left a deep wound. She knew he was trapped under his mother's control, but she also knew she couldn't save him anymore. She couldn't allow herself to get lost in the whirlwind of lies and manipulations that Bullen and Mariana had woven around them. As she prepared a cup of tea, she felt a sudden wave of nausea. She had been feeling exhausted for days, but today was different. She placed a hand on her stomach, feeling a slight pressure, and suddenly, a thought hit her like a lightning bolt. Could she be? She shook her head, trying to push the idea away, but the discomfort persisted. She set the cup aside and left the house, heading to the nearest pharmacy. A few minutes later, she was back, sitting in the bathroom, holding the pregnancy test in her hand. She waited, feeling her heart pound in her ears. When the result appeared, her entire world seemed to freeze. Positive. Gabriella remained still, processing the reality of what she had just discovered. A whirlwind of emotions engulfed her: fear, confusion, but also a deep sense of protection. Now, she had more than just herself to take care of. There was a new life inside her, and that life depended on her decisions. At that moment, her phone rang. It was Yusuf. "Gabriella, we need to talk," he said, his voice filled with an urgency Gabriella hadn't heard before. She took a deep breath, feeling that her world was about to take an even more unexpected turn. "What do you want to talk about?" she responded, trying to keep her voice calm, even though the news of her pregnancy was on the verge of overwhelming her. "My mother, she's not well. I want to talk about what's going to happen now, how we're going to handle this," Yusuf said hesitantly. Gabriella knew she couldn't tell him about the pregnancy yet. Not in the middle of this storm. But she also knew she had to set clear conditions. Her life, and that of her future child, could no longer be under Bullen's control or Mariana's manipulations. "Yusuf, we need to be honest," Gabriella said. "We can't keep pretending your mother isn't destroying our life. It's not just that she's manipulating you, she's involved in something dangerous. This has to end." "I know," Yusuf said, in a defeated tone. "I know I've messed everything up. But I can't leave her, Gabby. She needs me." Gabriella felt anger rise in her chest. How could he still defend Bullen after everything she had discovered? "Yusuf, she doesn't need you," Gabriella exclaimed, unable to hold back any longer. "She's been using you. She's been using both of us. If you stay under her control, you'll never get out of this." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Yusuf was trapped, and Gabriella was starting to accept that he might never break free from the cycle. "I need time to think," Yusuf finally said, his voice broken. "I'll call you later." Gabriella hung up, feeling a mix of relief and despair. She knew Yusuf was facing his own demons, but she also knew she couldn't wait for him anymore. Now, more than ever, she had to prioritize her safety and that of her baby. Later that day, Gabriella met with Laura at a nearby cafe. She was the only person Gabriella could fully trust at this point, the only one who had stood by her side since everything began to fall apart. "Are you okay?" Laura asked, noticing Gabriella's weary expression. Gabriella let out a long sigh, staring at the cup of tea in front of her. "I'm pregnant," she confessed bluntly, feeling as though the words both freed and suffocated her at the same time. Laura looked at her, stunned, but quickly responded. She took Gabriella's hand and squeezed it tightly. "Are you sure? What are you going to do?" Gabriella felt a lump in her throat but forced herself to keep talking. "I can't keep living like this, Laura. I can't stay trapped in this manipulation. Yusuf won't change as long as Bullen is in his life, and now I have to think about what's best for me and the baby." Laura nodded, understanding. "It's a tough decision, but you're doing the right thing. If Yusuf isn't willing to face the truth, then you have to protect yourself. No one else is going to do it for you." Laura's words resonated with Gabriella. She was right. Gabriella had spent too much time waiting for Yusuf to open his eyes, hoping that somehow everything would resolve itself. But now, she had to take control of her own life. That afternoon, when she returned home, Gabriella felt a renewed sense of determination. She knew the time for difficult decisions had arrived. She couldn't wait any longer. If she wanted a safe future for herself and her child, she had to act. She sat in the living room, phone in hand, and dialed the number of the lawyer she had previously contacted. "I need to move forward with what we discussed," she said, feeling a mix of fear and resolve within her. "I want to make sure my assets are protected." As she spoke to the lawyer, Gabriella felt that, for the first time in months, she was taking control of her life. She was no longer the vulnerable woman trapped in a web of lies. Now, she had something to fight for, and nothing or no one was going to stand in her way. When she hung up, a wave of emotions overwhelmed her, but she also felt a deep sense of clarity. She knew the path ahead would be difficult, that the decisions she made from that moment on would have profound repercussions on her life. But she also knew it was the right thing to do. That evening, as Yusuf returned home, Gabriella sat waiting on the sofa. Her face was serious, and in her eyes, there was a determination Yusep hadn't seen before. He walked in, looking at her cautiously. "We need to talk," Gabriella said, not giving him time to respond. "I've made a decision. This ends here. If you want to stay with your mother and continue being tangled in her lies, that's your choice. But I'm not going to keep living like this." Yusep opened his mouth to respond, but Gabriella interrupted him. "I'm pregnant, Yusep. And this baby needs a safe environment, far from all this chaos. So, you have a choice to make. Either you cut ties with your mother and face the truth with me, or I'm leaving. But I won't let Boleyn keep destroying our lives." The silence that followed was devastating. Yusep looked at her, unable to process the news. But Gabriella already knew what his answer would be. She didn't need to hear it. She had made her decision. And now, for the first time in a long time, she felt in control of her own destiny. Gabriella stood in front of Yusep, arms crossed, waiting for an answer she knew would never come in the way she needed. The silence that had fallen between them was like an invisible wall separating everything. Yusep remained still, his eyes reflecting a confusion that Gabriella had come to know well. Part of him was struggling, but another, the part trapped under Boleyn's manipulation, seemed completely paralyzed. "I don't know what to say," Yusep whispered, his voice barely audible, as if he struggled to find the words. Gabriella sighed. This time there was no room for hesitation, for half-truths. She had to be firm, for herself, for the baby, and for the future she so desperately wanted to protect. "You don't have to say anything, Yusep," she said, with a calm that didn't match the inner turmoil consuming her. "With this, you've already said everything. I just want you to understand that this is the end. I can't keep living with the shadow of your mother in our lives. And now, with this baby, things have to change." Yusep stared at her, a glimmer of desperation in his eyes. Gabriella could see his lips trembling, as if he was about to speak, but in the end, all that came out was a mix of empty whispers. "I don't know how to do it. She's my mother. She's always been there, always told me what to do. I don't know how to distance myself from her," he admitted, and for the first time in a long time, Gabriella saw Yusep not as the man who had hidden so much, but as the broken child who had been manipulated his entire life. Gabriella felt a pang of sadness. She knew that part of Yusep was trapped in a cycle of emotional dependence from which he couldn't free himself. But she also knew that she couldn't be the one to rescue him. Not anymore. "Then you'll have to learn how to do it, Yusep," she said firmly. "Because I can't wait while you figure it out, while your mother keeps destroying everything we have. I've already made my decision." Yusep pressed his lips together and lowered his head. Gabriella knew at that moment that he understood the implications of her words. But still, he didn't move, didn't say anything else. Gabriella felt a mix of liberation and sorrow. Part of her wished he had the strength to fight for them, but the other part already knew this was for the best. She had realized that she couldn't change him, and that her own life, and now her child's, were the most important things. That night, Gabriella packed some of her things without saying anything more to Yusep. She knew she didn't need to. He had remained in the living room, sitting silently, as if each passing minute sunk him deeper into his own dilemma. The night was quiet, but the atmosphere in the house was tense, loaded with unspoken emotions. Before leaving, Gabriella paused at the living room door. Yusep looked up and gazed at her, his eyes dark, tired. "Is this goodbye?" he asked, his voice broken. Gabriella shook her head softly. "I don't know, Yusep. That's up to you." She gave him one last look before opening the door and stepping out, feeling the cool night air hit her face. With every step she took away from that house, Gabriella felt a weight lift off her shoulders. Despite the pain this decision caused her, she knew it was the right one. This wasn't just a marital argument. It was a battle for her dignity, for her peace, and now, for the life growing inside her. The following days were strange. Gabriella stayed temporarily at Laura's house, who, as always, welcomed her with open arms and the unconditional support that only a lifelong friend could offer. "You did the right thing, Gabby," Laura said one morning as they shared breakfast. "Sometimes the only way to save yourself is to walk away from the chaos." Gabriella nodded, though she still felt a kind of emptiness. She couldn't help but think of Yusep, wondering if he was okay, if he would finally make the decision to free himself from Bullen. But for now, she had to focus on herself, on her baby, and on rebuilding her life from scratch. One afternoon, several days later, Gabriella received an unexpected call. The number was unknown, but she felt a pang in her chest as she answered. It was Yusep. "Gabriella, I need to see you," he said with an urgency Gabriella hadn't heard before. "Yusep, I don't know if that's a good idea," she replied, not wanting to fall into the same emotional trap again. "Please, it's important," he insisted. "Just give me a chance to explain." Against her better judgment, Gabriella agreed to meet him at a nearby cafe. She didn't know what to expect, but she was willing to listen. When she arrived, she found Yusep sitting at a table, his gaze distant. He looked as if he had aged in those few days, and when he saw her, he immediately stood up, nervous. "Thank you for coming," he said, with a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. Gabriella sat across from him in silence, waiting for him to speak. "I've been thinking a lot," Yusep said, without preamble, "about everything that's happened, about my mother, about us. And I realized something that's been hard for me to accept. My mother has always controlled me, always known how to manipulate me into doing what she wanted. But that doesn't justify her. Or me." Gabriella looked at him, surprised by the honest and vulnerable tone in his voice. But she said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "I always thought that helping her was my duty, my responsibility. But I've realized that this responsibility has cost me everything else, including the person I love most." Yusep looked at her directly, his eyes filled with sadness. "And I've decided to cut ties. I've distanced myself from my mother." Gabriella's heart skipped a beat at those words, but she couldn't let herself be swayed just by them. "And what does that mean, Yusep?" she asked, her tone firm. "It's not enough to just say it. I need to know that this isn't just another empty promise." Yusep nodded. "I know. I've already started taking action. I talked to a lawyer to make sure my mother no longer has access to my finances. And I'm getting help, therapy, because I know this goes beyond what I can handle on my own." Gabriella listened, surprised by the determination in his words. For the first time in a long while, she felt that maybe Yusep was really taking control of his life. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away, Gabby," Yusep said, his voice breaking. "I just wanted you to know that I'm willing to fight, not just for you, but for myself. Because I've realized that if I don't, I'm going to lose everything." Gabriella felt a surge of mixed emotions. She wanted to believe him, but the fear of being hurt again still lingered. "I need time, Yusep," she finally replied. "A lot has happened, and I don't know if everything can be fixed. But if you've really changed, maybe we can find a way forward." Yusep nodded, his eyes full of hope. "I understand. I just ask for a chance to show you that I can be the man you deserve." Gabriella stood up from the table, feeling a slight sense of relief. She didn't know what the future would bring, but at least, for the first time in a long while, she felt there was a small possibility of redemption, both for Yusep and for herself. The road wouldn't be easy, but now there was hope. Days later, Gabriella walked barefoot along the beach, letting the soft ocean breeze caress her face. The sun was about to set on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with fresh air as she felt an inner peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. Since distancing herself from Yusep, she had spent time rebuilding herself, healing the deep wounds that the relationship and lies had left in her life. Months had passed since her last encounter with Yusep. After that conversation at the cafe, he had kept his promise. He had distanced himself from his mother and started therapy to break the toxic ties that Bullen had woven around him. However, Gabriella knew that her path to healing didn't depend on him, but on herself. She was expecting a baby, and the life growing inside her was her priority. During those months, Gabriella had made crucial decisions. She bought a small house near the beach, a place where she could start anew. Laura had supported her every step of the way, visiting her weekly and accompanying her to medical appointments. Gabriella had learned to trust her intuition and, most importantly, her own strength. One afternoon, while reading on the porch of her new home, her phone rang. It was Yusuf. She hesitated for a moment before answering, but decided to hear what he had to say. "Hello, Gabriella," Yusuf said, his voice calm, almost serene. "Hello, Yusuf," she replied, calmly. "I know it's been a while since we talked, but I wanted to know how you are. I've been thinking a lot about you, and the baby." His voice sounded sincere, as if he was genuinely concerned. Gabriella smiled slightly as she listened to him. There was an honesty in his tone she hadn't felt before, but she also knew she was no longer willing to let her emotions cloud her judgment. "I'm doing well, Yusuf," she responded. "I've been focusing on my life, the baby, and what I truly want for the future." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, as if Yusuf was carefully choosing his words. "I want you to know that I've been working on myself. I've kept my distance from my mother, and I've learned a lot over these months. I would like to be there for the baby. I don't expect everything to be like it was before, but I want to be a good father." Gabriella was silent for a moment, reflecting on his words. She knew that the love she once had for Yusuf hadn't completely disappeared, but she also knew that her priority now was her child and their well-being. "Yusuf, I know you're making an effort, and I appreciate that. But the most important thing now is our child. We can talk about how to make this work, but whatever happens between us will be very different from what it was before," she said firmly. Yusuf nodded on the other end of the phone, his tone more resolute than she had expected. "I understand. What matters most to me is the baby's well-being. I'll do whatever it takes to be part of their life, always respecting your decisions." Gabriella hung up the phone feeling calm. There was still much to resolve, but for the first time, she felt that Yusuf was ready to leave the past behind and move forward in a healthy way. However, she knew that for now, she needed to stay focused on what she had built for herself. Months passed, and the most important day of her life finally arrived, the birth of her child. In the delivery room, with Laura by her side, Gabriella gave birth to a healthy baby boy, whom she named Samuel. When she held him in her arms for the first time, she felt as if the entire world had taken on a new meaning. Her little son was the reason she had fought so hard, the reason she had found the courage to leave behind what wasn't good for her. It was the beginning of a new life. Yusuf, as he had promised, came to the hospital to meet his son. When he entered the room, his eyes filled with tears as he saw Samuel. Gabriella allowed him to hold the baby, watching as tenderness appeared in Yusuf's gestures as he cradled the newborn in his arms. "He's beautiful, Gabriella," Yusuf murmured with a sincere smile. "Thank you for giving me this chance." Gabriella, though moved, knew that the road ahead would not be easy. But for the first time, both seemed to be in the same emotional place. While their romantic relationship was no longer what it once was, they could find a new way to be a family. As the years passed, Gabriella and Yusuf found a balance. They didn't become a couple again, but they built a solid friendship based on mutual respect and shared love for Samuel. Gabriella moved on with her life, creating a home filled with peace and love, while Yusuf fulfilled his role as a father, showing that he had changed and was willing to be a positive influence in their son's life. The relationship with Bulin had been severed for good. After months of distance and therapy, Yusuf made it clear that he would not allow her to control his life anymore. Bulin, in turn, faded from their lives, caught up in her own problems, far from Gabriella and Samuel's reach. Time healed the wounds. Gabriella, with her spirit renewed, watched Samuel run along the beach every evening as the sun set, and she felt grateful for the path she had chosen. It hadn't been easy, but each decision had been a step toward freedom, toward a life filled with purpose and love. One day, as she watched her son play, Gabriella smiled, feeling the breeze caress her face and the warmth of the sun envelop her heart. Life, she thought, didn't always unfold as planned, but sometimes, when you had the courage to move forward, It led you exactly to where you needed to be. If you enjoyed this story, I invite you to leave a comment on how you felt while listening to it, and if you've gone through a similar situation of betrayal, I'd love to hear your valuable opinion. I'd be honored if you left a like, shared the video with a friend or family member, and subscribed to the channel. Don't miss the next amazing story that's popping up on your screen right now. We have guaranteed entertainment just for you. See you in the next video.